Hello and welcome to another 5-in-1 Mayaani Talks. I've got a bit of extra lighting today because here in the UK on this particular day it's very grey. And despite my workspace and studio having quite a lot of wonderful large windows, um, it just isn't quite working today. So here we go, a bit of extra lighting. You may recall that at the moment, what I'm doing in these current videos is sharing my own exploration and journey into looking at different jewelry traditions across the globe. Now, I've already shared with you some fascinating traditions, by no means covering all the traditions present across Africa. So I have two videos out already. If you haven't checked them out, I invite you to do so in your own time and as and when or if the interest takes you there, to look at six fantastic and fascinating African jewelry traditions. Today, however, I thought we would go along and look at the Americas and explore some of the fascinating jewelry traditions of the indigenous people of North America in particular. So, of course, as usual, there are a couple of facts that I like to share, and these facts sometimes they're more food for thought than actual facts, but there is some fact to them, which is why I call them facts. But I like to think of them more now as I'm growing and evolving in how I think about about these facts as invitations for us to think about what the information is that is being shared and to make up our own minds about what we feel about it. And the whole point of this space, for those of you who are new, is to encourage us to, if we are not already, to become more conscious about our jewelry choices. Because once upon a time, jewelry, and not just jewelry that you wore every day, luxury jewelry worn by regal, members of royal families, held a lot more meaning for us as a human race, because this was true of many cultures across the globe, not just specific to an individual culture in one particular region. It was something that globally, as a human race, we found meaning in our jewelry. And actually, adornment, interestingly enough, is something we have a very long and rich history with. I wonder if you yourself knew that, as far as we know so far, based on archaeological finds in Africa, that our relationship with creating pieces of jewelry, specifically jewelry, but adorning ourselves in that way with things other than just your basic clothes that you might need to wear, our history of wearing pieces of jewelry dates as far back as 142 to 150,000 years. Now, of course, you may have heard of the shell beads found in South Africa. Just going to refer to my notes to see if I can pinpoint exactly which ones they were. The Blombos cave beads in South Africa. Those were discovered by archaeologists and date back about 75,000 years. However, there have been findings of cave beads in Morocco, and apologies for my pronunciation here, but the Bizmoune, from what I'm pronouncing it as, the Bizmoune cave beads of Morocco, those are a collection of 33 perforated shell beads, the shell beads being the shells of the Narsarius gibbosulus sea snails. And these 33 beads show evidence of being deliberately perforated, having deliberate drill marks in them, showing smoothing around the holes, which would have been deliberate, of course. If it was naturally created, the holes, it would not be smooth. But there's smoothing around the holes, and also wear on the shells from repetitive movement where they have been worn. So those particular beads, the ones found in Morocco, date back around 142 to 150,000 years. So clearly, adorning ourselves is something that has been much more deeply meaningful to us for quite a period of time. And the creation of jewelry and our idea of wearing jewelry on our bodies dates back almost as far as early modern human culture, as the appearance of early modern human culture. So that's a fascinating thought in itself. But looking at the Americas today specifically, I thought we would look at five fascinating facts, for want of a better word, that may encourage us together to think of jewelry in a different way, or perhaps just add to our growing awareness and realization of just how beautiful it is for us to return, I feel, in a sense, to holding pieces of jewelry in our lives, including luxury jewelry, more specifically luxury jewelry, because that is where I think in particular the meaning has been lost. But returning to that finding the meaning that is deeply personal and symbolic and represents so much more than just the materials which our jewelry is composed of. So, looking at fact number one, of course, for many indigenous communities across North America, you may already be familiar, but beadworking became a way to preserve identity under colonization. So when they were under the threat of their culture being erased, jewelry was one of the ways in which the indigenous communities of North America held on to their culture. And it wasn't just jewelry they created, it was their beadworking traditions in general that allowed them to keep their culture and traditions alive, alongside other practices, of course, but that was one of the key ways in which they preserved their culture and their traditions in the face of such challenging times. In a sense, um, this beadwork artistry and their use of beadwork artistry was a form of a survival technique. One could say it was a form of survival. And they used, of course, their beadworking techniques to create pieces not just of jewelry, but of jewelry including other adornments from clothing, footwear, bags, belts, headdresses. They used their beadwork artistry to communicate three key things: their identity, because different regions, different communities of indigenous people of North America had their own jewelry beadwork styles. They communicate their identity. They communicated their spirituality, with much of their beadwork artistry consisting of spiritual symbols or having spiritual symbolism woven into it. And also, thirdly, they reflected through their beadwork artistry their connection to the land. So you can see how jewelry, which was one element and one form of creation they used their beadwork artistry to bring to life, how jewelry was a very deeply meaningful thing to the indigenous communities of North America beyond just adornment and beautification. Fact number two, um, glass beads, interestingly enough, and it may not be that surprising, of course, came into the indigenous communities of North America through European traders, and they replaced the original materials, the traditional materials, which were being used by indigenous communities to weave their beadwork works of art, and heritage and culture and tradition. And essentially, the indigenous communities of North America, typically before the European traders arrived with glass seed beads, they were using stones, shells, feathers, porcupine quills, to name just a few of the materials they used. But they were using, and shells as well. They were using these materials to weave their beadwork art until the glass seed beads arrived. And why is this fascinating? For two reasons. First of all, this particular point, I think, really helps to highlight how traditions have always evolved. So, in the case of these indigenous communities, they replaced their traditional materials with glass seed beads, but the tradition was still kept alive, because essentially the tradition, the essence of that tradition, was the storytelling and the preservation of culture and heritage and family lineage through the beadwork artistry. And that was still be able to be kept alive. All they did was replace their original materials with these now newer, perhaps more fascinating materials, perhaps more colorful and accessible materials. Perhaps these materials lended themselves better to being woven into intricate patterns. For whatever reason, they moved away from their traditional materials that they were using before to using glass seed beads without losing the value or the essence of their tradition. So essentially, traditions have always evolved. And the other fascinating thing that we may think of when we discover this particular point or explore this particular point is the fact that what we currently, in our present day, consider to be traditional indigenous beadwork artistry is actually going far back to the point where, they didn't have glassy beads to begin with and they came in. It's actually a form of adaptation, because essentially they adapted their bead working traditions to accommodate this new material, in essence replacing the older materials they used for these new materials, but without losing their heritage. So what we think of as tradition in many parts of the world today, it's questionable how much of a pure original tradition that is, because traditions have always been evolving. Fact number three. When it came to crafting, of course, the jewelry, sorry, of the indigenous tribes of or indigenous people of North America, when it came to their jewelry was not just used as a status symbol, because there were differences between the type of jewelry worn by, for example, the chiefs versus, the warriors versus the individuals who were just part of the community. But also in ceremony, they had a lot of ceremonial applications. So looking at the Navajo, apologies for pronunciation again, but the Navajo turquoise silver jewelry, for example, that was very much associated with spiritual balance and protection. You've also got the Mayan jade jewelry, which is a symbol of life force and royalty. And then the Aztec gold ornaments, which seemed to have been used as markers of divine authority. So you can see how the jewelry that was being created within the indigenous communities of North America was not just communicated for the purposes of wearing something beautiful, for the purposes of communicating your status, but also for a very ceremonial reason, for a very strong spiritual reason, and to communicate different messages and different meanings amongst the community members as well. So the jury, essentially, for many indigenous communities across North America, connected or acted as a way for human beings, for the people of their community, to connect more with nature, with the cosmos, the universe, and of course with their spiritual belief systems as well. So the question here, I suppose, or the fascinating food question we may want to ask ourselves, food for thought, I was going to say, the fascinating food for thought or question we might want to ask ourselves here is, at what point did jewelry shift away from being something that was very deeply meaningful to us to being something we just considered more from a surface level a viewpoint in terms of materials? And when it comes to luxury, that's particularly important to consider, because much of luxury jewelry today is considered very much from the viewpoint of the materials used to create the jewelry and nothing beyond that. I'd like to think that is slowly changing. But essentially, we have always viewed luxury jewelry in more recent times as being made of certain materials. But once upon a time, the materials were neither here nor there. The essence of the luxury lay in the storytelling, the narrative, and what it represented, in the use of symbols, and the use of patterns, and the use of textures and colors and shapes, and in who was weaving the artistry as well, the luxury piece of jewelry as well. Fact number four: crafting traditions have generally belonged, when it comes to beadwork, to women. Not just beadworking, but specifically commenting on beadworking here because I haven't looked into other crafting forms to verify. But essentially, a lot of crafting traditions, beadworking traditions in particular, have been primarily the work of women and have been primarily preserved by women. And beadworking, traditionally practiced by women across the indigenous communities of North America, was something that was passed down from mother to daughter. So it was kept in the maternal line, passed from mother to daughter for generations. And through the beadworking techniques and through passing down this wisdom and knowledge of the beadworking, essentially the women were able to not only sort of communicate stories, because essentially their patterns were a language. They communicated things about their community, about the time that they were living in. They were also able to communicate family lineage. So, as I mentioned, certain regions of the country, or certain regions would have their own regional style when it came to beadworking, and certain communities with amongst the indigenous tribes or indigenous people of North America would have their own unique style of bead weaving as well. So essentially, you are not only communicating stories about the times you are living, communicating stories about your past that you've inherited from your ancestors. You are also communicating very real information about yourself in your current time, not only telling individuals through your jewelry your age, your status within the community, but also which community you belong to and where you come from, simply through what you are wearing without ever having to say a word. And fact number five: much of the indigenous jewelry that we see today is um, a representation, unfortunately, a fashion representation of the original beadwork artistry. So when indigenous communities have their traditional inherited cultural beadwork artistry being, not, I don't want to say exploited, but being used essentially for the purposes of fashion, being wildly reproduced as fashion, there can be feelings of not just discomfort, but also perhaps anger, resentment that arise within the indigenous communities. Because essentially, when you do that, when you take a particular culture's heritage and turn it into a mass produced or fast produced or reproduced form of fashion without giving proper credit to that particular community, and without ensuring that that community, if where the community is still perhaps consulted for creating the designs, where they're not paid financially for their involvement, that's where I think the problem arises. I think when we want to turn indigenous forms of art into fashion, it's very important that we give proper credit to the indigenous communities from whom that style has, or to whom we owe credit for that style, to whom we should be giving our thanks, because without them preserving that kind of beadworking tradition in this case, we would not have it present today. So there's that, recognizing which indigenous community we have to give thanks to for the presence of this particular work of art we've been able to create now in this particular style. But we also have to make sure that we are financially um, compensating is not perhaps the best word, but essentially making sure rewarding. We have to make sure that we're financially rewarding these communities where their artisans might still be involved in supporting us to create these fashion pieces. So that's fact number five. And looking at a little bit more into the distinct visual styles, I thought we might look at a few of them in my next video, not necessarily this video, but actually it brought to mind Scottish tartan. When I was looking at the fact that indigenous communities, through their beadwork artistry, could capture family lineage, Scottish tartan came to mind. Now, there is an interesting difference though. With Scottish tartan, often a family pattern remains fixed, it's very rigid. It's the same pattern of tartan that's passed down to generations, or things are made out of it. With the indigenous communities of North America, however, it was not such a rigid system. There was a way in which they could communicate their family and which community they belonged to without having to have their pieces of artwork follow a rigid structure and pattern, which I think is fascinating in itself. There's more fluidity in the ability for the artisan to express themselves creatively while still being able to capture the family or community to which they belong. And they did that a lot through shapes, patterns, but also sticking to certain color palettes as well. We'll explore more in my next video. For now, if you've enjoyed today's video, I welcome your thoughts, first of all, on what you found. If you found anything most fascinating from this particular video, I'd love to know. Please share with me in the comments below. I love reading those. Of course, if you enjoyed today's video, please hit the thumbs up button. That really supports me to encourage more people to, if they are not already, to think about jewelry, specifically luxury jewelry, from a more conscious viewpoint. And I think when we do that as well, personally speaking, when you start to see your jewelry as much more deep and meaningful to you than just a surface level aesthetic, then you end up having less jewelry in your jewelry wardrobe to begin with, because the pieces you now possess are worn so much more frequently. They essentially become an extension of you and so synonymous with who you are that not wearing them might almost feel like you're missing a part of yourself. So you wear them so much more frequently, and you find yourself focusing less on less and less on, matching your pieces to what you're wearing per se. They don't have to, because when they're deeply meaningful and personal, they communicate in such a beautiful way when you wear them that no one is going to see this discoordination that's taking place that you might have at one point believed was present before you started looking at jewelry from a more meaningful point of view. So yes, please do hit that thumbs up button so we can encourage more people to think about jewelry more consciously. And of course, if you're enjoying the content so far, I welcome you to subscribe and to hit the notification bell. I produce one video a week, and I cannot wait to explore more the indigenous communities of North America and their jewelry styles with you in my next one. For now, remember, because your jewelry should always be more than just an afterthought. Bye for now.